The summer sun hung heavy over Paris, pressing its heat into the cobblestones, drawing the sour stench of blood from the stones of the Place de la Révolution. The crowd had already gathered, a restless tide of bodies, shopkeepers abandoning their stalls, mothers with children perched on their hips, ragged veterans leaning on crutches, all here for the same grim theater. The tricolor flags trembled in the faint wind, and in their shadow stood the guillotine, tall and patient, its blade catching the light like a frozen stroke of lightning. Through the narrow streets came the cart. Its wheels creaked over the uneven stones, flanked by soldiers with bayonets glinting in the sun. Inside, slumped against the wooden boards, sat the man they once called l'incorruptible, Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the Revolution's most merciless season, the man whose voice had sent thousands to this very square. His powdered hair was disheveled, his pale skin slick with sweat. Blood seeped from the bandages wrapped around his jaw, the ruin of a failed suicide that had stolen his ability to speak. Once, his words had been sharper than any blade, words that could turn suspicion into a death sentence, words that could fill this very square with the roar of approval. Now, all that remained was the silence. Faces in the crowd leaned forward, searching for the fire they remembered in his eyes. Some came to jeer, others to weep in secret, but most came to witness the revolution devour its own child. As the cart rolled past, old allies looked away. The same hands that had applauded his speeches now clutched at their coats, eager to disown him. The scaffold loomed ahead, its wooden frame stained with the dark memory of thousands. Robespierre lifted his gaze, staring at the blade as if recognizing an old acquaintance. There was no plea for mercy, no confession, no grand farewell. Only the slow, deliberate beating of his heart, matching the muffled drums that marked each step toward the end. The crowd leaned in. The executioner stepped forward. And somewhere, in that moment before the drop, Paris seemed to hold its breath. For on this day, the blade would turn, not toward the king, nor the queen, nor the enemy beyond the walls, but toward the very man who had made it the heart of the revolution's justice, a justice that had long since forgotten mercy. Part 1. The Idealist. Before the blood, before the blade, before the fear that clung to Paris like a winter fog, there was a man with a dream. Arras, 1780s. A modest provincial town tucked into the folds of northern France, its streets narrow and uneven, its air scented with baking bread and the faint musk of horse dung. Church bells marked the hours. Gossip and market chatter filled the spaces between. Along these streets walked the son of a modest lawyer, neither rich enough to command respect nor poor enough to be pitied. He lived in the thin space between privilege and want, where hunger could be staved off, but the taste of injustice was still sharp on the tongue. Maximilien Robespierre walked with books tucked under his arm, always books. Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire, the trinity of his private faith. In the quiet corners of his small study, candlelight trembled against the spines of borrowed volumes, his shadow flickering over pages marked with dense notes in a precise, almost obsessive hand. In those hours, he built a France that existed only in the mind, a nation where the law was not the property of kings, where bread was not a luxury, where a man's worth was measured by virtue, not birth. It was an architecture of ideals as intricate as the Gothic arches of the cathedral he passed each day, and he believed quietly, fiercely, that it could be real. To his peers, he was earnest to a fault. He spoke as if each sentence were part of a sacred oath, as though truth itself might shatter if he spoke carelessly. They called him l'incorruptible even then, not as a title of honor, but as a gentle tease. Too pure, too stubborn, too unwilling to bend. Then 1789 arrived. It was as if history had been listening to him all along. France trembled on the edge of collapse. The king's coffers were bare, the people's stomachs emptier still, the old order cracking like ice beneath too much weight. The Estates General was summoned, a gathering so rare it had been lifetimes since it last met. Clergy, nobility, and commoners came to Versailles to decide the nation's fate. Robespierre was sent as a delegate of the Third Estate, the voice of the common people. Paris, in that summer, was a city electrified. In the narrow streets, cries of liberté swelled against the walls. The Bastille fell in a storm of powder smoke and shattered stone. The tricolor unfurled above the city like a promise. In the halls of the National Assembly, Robespierre found his stage. His voice, thin but unshaking, cut through the arguments and counter-arguments. He spoke of equality not as a hope, but as a certainty waiting to be claimed. He refused bribes, refused titles, refused to stand anywhere but with the people. When others hesitated, he pressed forward. When others compromised, he held the line. Those first months were painted in the warm gold of optimism. It seemed, for a moment, that the incorruptible might truly bend the arc of history toward justice, that France might finally belong to her people. But history bends for no one without a price, and the price had yet to be paid. Part 2, Rise of the Incorruptible. Revolutions do not stand still. They move like storms, gathering strength, darkening skies, breaking whatever stands in their way. What began as speeches and petitions soon spilled into the streets in rivers of anger. The king, once untouchable, now stood before his people as a man on trial. The golden sun of monarchy dimmed, then cracked, then shattered entirely. The tide that had lifted Robespierre from the quiet streets of Arras now swept him into the center of the maelstrom. By 1792, the revolution's dream of liberty was surrounded on all sides. France was at war with nearly all of Europe, Austria, Prussia, Britain, each determined to strangle the newborn republic before it could take its first breath. Inside the country, the soil itself seemed to rebel. In the Vendée, peasants and priests rose against the Republic. In Paris, royalist whispers curdled into plots. Bread grew scarce. Hunger gnawed at even the most loyal citizens. The enemies of the revolution were no longer abstract. They had faces, names, armies, and flags, and Robespierre's voice changed. The man who once dreamed of virtue began to speak the language of survival. Survival demanded vigilance. Vigilance demanded sacrifice. And sacrifice, he declared, demanded the blade. The Committee of Public Safety was born, a government within the government, swift and absolute, with power that could not be appealed. At its center sat Robespierre, pale, meticulous, unyielding. While others flaunted silks and powdered wigs, he wore plain coats and carried himself with the severity of a man whose faith was in principles, not appearances. But power clung to him all the same, invisible and heavy as a cloak. In the National Convention, his speeches blended moral purity with quiet menace. He quoted Rousseau like scripture, invoking the general will as the highest law. But in his hands, that will became a blade, capable of cutting down anyone who stood in its path. The revolution must be defended at all costs, he said, and each week the definition of enemy stretched a little wider. The guillotine rose in the Place de la Révolution, its tall frame painted a deep theatrical red. At first, it claimed the old order, counts and dukes, bishops and generals, the surviving skeleton of a toppled throne. Crowds cheered. Justice, they believed, was swift at last. But the blade did not stop there. It turned next to journalists whose pens strayed too far, to priests who refused the Republic's oaths, to generals suspected of insufficient zeal, and finally, to the revolution's own children, deputies, allies, friends who hesitated when Robespierre demanded they march further. He was still l'incorruptible, but now the word carried a different edge. It no longer meant a man immune to bribes. It meant a man immune to mercy, a man who would not be swayed from his path, no matter how many bodies it required to clear the way. Paris watched with a mixture of awe and dread. His figure on the convention floor seemed untouchable, almost spectral, thin, pale, eyes glittering with the certainty of a prophet. Whispers followed him. He is too powerful now, too certain, too dangerous. Yet still, the crowds roared when he passed. Only the tone had changed. Cheers now sounded more like prayers, as if to shout loud enough might save one from becoming the next name on his list. Robespierre did not notice, or perhaps he did, and welcomed it. Part 3. The Reign of Terror. By the autumn of 1793, Paris no longer breathed. It held its breath. The air itself seemed to weigh more, thickened by the smell of fear and the smoke of cooking fires gone cold too soon. Boots scraped over the cobblestones like whispers of an approaching fate. Even the sound of church bells, now replaced by the harsh clang of civic clocks, felt like a reminder that time itself had been claimed by the revolution. The city had once sung with the chants of liberty. Now it murmured in low voices, syllables swallowed before they could reach the wrong ears. The revolution, once a sunrise breaking over the Bastille, had become a furnace, its flames white-hot, merciless, and indiscriminate. The law of suspects turned the ground beneath every citizen's feet into thin ice. Enemies could be made out of neighbors, traitors out of friends, conspirators out of one's own blood. A careless word at the marketplace, an unguarded look during a speech, the absence of enough zeal in a cheer, these were no longer lapses of judgment, but signatures on one's own death warrant. To be accused was almost to be condemned. To defend oneself was to prove the accuser's point. And through it all, the guillotine worked. Each morning, the carts rolled from the dark, damp cells of the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution. Wooden wheels squealed under the weight of the living, soon to be dead. Drums beat to drown their voices, not out of cruelty, but out of efficiency, so that no final speech might spark sympathy or rebellion. The executioner's assistants moved with mechanical precision. Leather aprons stiff with dried blood. Heads fell into wicker baskets lined with sawdust. The blade was wiped clean with a practiced swipe, and the cycle began again before the crowd's cheers had faded into the wind. Robespierre did not need to be there in person. His presence was in every charge read aloud, every sentence passed, every drop of the blade. He presided over the revolution like a surgeon over an endless operation, distant from the gore, but the architect of every cut. In the convention, he spoke with the fervor of a prophet and the precision of a prosecutor. France's enemies, he warned, were everywhere, in salons, in churches, in back rooms, in the quiet hesitation before applause. "Virtue without terror is powerless," he declared. "Terror without virtue is murderous." It was a neat phrase, a balance of ideals, but in practice, virtue had already been eclipsed by terror. The guillotine's victims were no longer just the architects of the old order. Georges Danton, once his friend, now his liability, was dragged to the blade for daring to call for mercy. Camille Desmoulins, the fiery journalist who had once roused the people to storm the Bastille, was silenced forever for criticizing the endless executions. Marie Antoinette, stripped of her crown and title, now the widow Capet, rode to the scaffold in a jolting peasant's cart. Her bound hands trembled only once, when she stepped on the executioner's foot and, in a whisper of her old courtly grace, apologized. Madame Roland, whose salon had been a crucible for revolutionary ideas, mounted the steps with her head high. Looking to the sky, she left Paris with words that would outlive her. "O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name! Even children were not beyond reach." A girl of 14, accused of crying when her parents were arrested, was condemned for counter-revolutionary sentiment. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner, would later write that her eyes haunted him. But when the signal came, the blade fell all the same. Life adapted to survive. Conversations ended mid-sentence at the sound of unfamiliar footsteps. Neighbors passed without greeting. Families learned to wear joy like a mask, cheering for the revolution even when it claimed their own. The tricolor still fluttered over the city, but it might as well have been a warning flag. And at the heart of it all sat Robespierre, his desk lit by a single candle, a neat ledger before him. The lists were written in the same precise hand he had once used to copy Rousseau's treatises. The pen had not changed. Only the ink was different now. Part 4. The Fall. Power, like the blade, is sharpest just before it drops. By the summer of 1794, the revolution's furnace was burning too hot, consuming not only its enemies, but its own fuel. The crowds were thinner at the executions now. The applause sounded brittle, nervous. Even the most zealous patriots began to wonder if the list would one day bear their names. Robespierre still spoke in the language of virtue, but to many, his words now tasted of fear. His circle had grown small, friends silenced, rivals executed, allies driven into exile or hiding. In the Committee of Public Safety, voices that once echoed his every decree began to tremble, then to argue, then to plot. They saw in him not the incorruptible guardian of the Republic, but a tyrant in plain clothes. The breaking point came in July. Robespierre delivered a speech accusing unnamed members of the convention of treachery. He refused to say who, letting suspicion seep into every seat like a slow poison. By the next morning, it was no longer paranoia. It was survival. Deputies who had cheered him yesterday now whispered of his arrest. On the night of 9th Thermidor, July 27th, the convention exploded into shouts. Cries of "Down with the tyrant" drowned out his protests. He was declared hors la loi, outside the law. His arrest meant death. They took him to the Hôtel de Ville, but the barricades did not rise for him. The Paris he had ruled with fear now watched in silence. Cornered and desperate, Robespierre tried to end his life with a pistol, but the shot only shattered his jaw. Blood poured down his coat, his eyes wide not with pain, but with the sudden knowledge that the machinery of terror no longer answered to him. At dawn, soldiers dragged him through the streets, his head bound in a blood-soaked bandage. The same people who once applauded his speeches now spat at him from doorways. His enemies didn't need to try him. He was already condemned. Somewhere behind him, the guillotine's blade was being hoisted into place, gleaming in the early light. The machine was ready, and now it was his turn. Part 5. The Blade Turns, July 28, 1794. The heat was already pressing down when the drums began to beat. The cart jolted forward from the conciergerie, its wheels groaning under the weight of 22 condemned men. At the center sat Maximilien Robespierre, head swaddled in filthy bandages, jaw hanging in ruin. Blood had dried in black streaks along his neck. He could not speak, but his eyes were still alive, sharp, restless, searching the crowd for, what? Pity? Loyalty? Or perhaps nothing at all. The streets were lined with faces. Some jeered, some turned away. A few stared as if watching a comet fall. An object once untouchable, now doomed to shatter on the earth. The cart rolled into the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine rose before him, red-painted timbers blazing under the sun. It seemed taller now, almost triumphant, its blade winking in the light, like it recognized its next and most famous victim. One by one, the others mounted the scaffold. Heads fell, baskets filled, the executioner working with the cold rhythm of a man long past horror. Each drop brought Robespierre closer to the steps. When his turn came, the executioner ripped away the bandages. The movement tore open the wound, and a muffled scream, half human, half animal, burst from his throat. The crowd roared at the sound. He was bound, positioned, his cheek pressed against the wood. The sun burned his skin. The smell of blood and sawdust filled his lungs. No speech, no farewell, only silence and the weight of 1,000 deaths returning in a single moment. The blade fell. It was quick. It was final. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner, held the head high for the crowd to see. Cheers erupted, wild and cathartic, echoing off the stone facades. Paris exhaled for the first time in a year. The guillotine had taken kings and queens, generals and poets, peasants and children. But today, it had taken the man who had made it king. Part 6. Echoes of Terror. When the crowd dispersed and the scaffold was washed clean, Paris seemed almost ordinary. The tricolor still hung limp in the heat. The Seine still carried its sluggish current. The vendors still called out their wares. But something had shifted, an invisible pressure released. For the first time in a year, people spoke freely in the streets, without glancing over their shoulders. The prisons began to empty. The revolutionary tribunal, once a machine of daily death, fell silent. The guillotine was dismantled from the Place de la Révolution, its timbers stored away as if the city wanted to hide the instrument that had been its heartbeat. But the shadow of the terror did not fade. It lingered in the silences between neighbors, in the wariness of strangers, in the way mothers told their children to be careful what they said. The revolution had promised liberty, equality, fraternity, yet left behind an intimacy with fear that would take generations to unlearn. Economically, the country limped. Skilled hands had been lost to the blade or driven into exile. The assignats lay nearly worthless, foreign trade strangled by suspicion. Outside France, the terror became a warning whispered by kings to their subjects, proof that liberty could turn to chaos and blood. And still, Robespierre's ghost clung to the revolution, not in statues or memorials, but in the questions he left behind. Can justice survive without mercy? Can virtue exist without compassion? When does the defense of freedom become the destruction of it? He had believed himself incorruptible, a servant of the people. But in the end, he became the mirror image of the tyrants he overthrew, certain that only his vision could save the Republic, blind to the cost in human lives. 2 centuries later, the lessons remain as sharp as the blade that took him. That power, unchecked, will turn on its wielder. That noble ends do not cleanse brutal means. That the line between defender and oppressor is thinner than we dare admit. On that summer day in 1794, the revolution devoured its own child, and in doing so, it left behind a truth as enduring as the Republic itself. Freedom is fragile, and the hands that claim to guard it must always be watched.